Tell me when we've got speed.
Yeah, speed.
And how long is the
So what do
tape?
you work at?
Closed door.
It can be as much as 95 minutes.
Okay, very good.
I think the door's okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Today is February 17, 2011. It is my honor and privilege to be interviewing Harry Middleton for the Richard Nixon Oral History Program here at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. Harry, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
Just to give us a little bit of biographical background, when did you join President Johnson's staff?
In the latter part of 1966, it wasn't his staff at that time. I worked on a commission that President Johnson had appointed to study selective service reform. Worked with that staff to write its report, and that led into the White House.
When did you enter the White House? When did you come into the White House?
It was the early part of '67, but it was all kind of, as I look back on it, I don't think anything has ever been put on paper, so I don't remember exactly when I walked over that invisible line from working on a commission to working on the staff. But anyway.
Can you give us, please, a sense of your duties in the White House?
Well, my duties, I was a writer, and I wrote speeches and messages to the Congress. That was exclusively what I did.
Let's move forward to March of 1968. Can you give us a word picture of what you remember from March 31st, 1968? When the president...
I remember that I was not in the White House when President Johnson made his speech. I was at home watching it on television, and I was stunned because I had no information at all that led me to think he was going to do that. I was a little disappointed because I had been writing speeches for what I thought was going to be his campaign, and I had really looked forward to 4 more years with him, but I quickly adjusted.
What was April 1st like in the White House?
Well, the thing that I remember mainly was that when I got to the White House the next day, he was making plans to go to Chicago to make another speech. And for a while it looked as if I was going to go with him. I did not. And I remember that he went to Chicago, and I'd forgotten who his speech was to be for, but he extemporized the line that all of us wish we had provided for him, which was, I said I would not run again as a candidate of my party. I didn't say anything about anybody else's party. You know.
When you were preparing those speeches for what you thought would be a re-election campaign in 1968, who did you think his opponent would be?
I just assumed it would be Nixon.
Were you in the White House the day that Bobby Kennedy and Ted Sorensen came to visit in April?
I was in the White House, but I was not involved in the action. I was wrapped up in the trauma of the thing, as everybody was, but I might as well have been a spectator outside because I had nothing to do with the president during that time. I was not involved in it.
We've interviewed some members of the Nixon administration who focused on the problem of how to repair the District of Columbia after the riots following Martin Luther King's assassination. What do you recall of being in Washington after Martin Luther King's assassination?
Well, the main thing I recall was stepping outside the White House on the front lawn and seeing the smoke that was rising from the blocks, just maybe 6 or 7 blocks away, and realizing how enormously close all of that was to that center of power. It was an incredible feeling, but that was really it.
What do you remember of the climate or mood in the White House after Bobby Kennedy was killed?
I don't think that I can tell you very much about that. I was mesmerized, as many of us were, by the television coverage of the train, the long train that was carrying, as I think I recall, from the train from wherever the train was carrying Bobby Kennedy. And I remember that, but that's really all I can remember about it. It was a traumatic affair, but and I know that it was a sense of shock, but it's kind of dim in my mind now.
Did you work on any speeches for President Johnson at that point that you can recall?
I guess the most important speech I worked on at that time, around that time, was after King's assassination, when the president decided that he was going to use that occasion to press for the third civil rights bill of his administration, the Open Housing Act. He had tried before to get it, and he couldn't get it through Congress. But he sensed this time, as he sensed in the time of President Kennedy's assassination, that the country was in such a state that it wanted something positive so he decided to press for that, and he got it through in very, very short order. And I wrote the statement that he made on signing that bill. And I remember it quite well because by this time I had worked for him long enough so that I thought I was pretty much in tune with the way he felt about things, and I felt that he trusted my judgment on it. So I wrote something not just to the effect, but I remember it said, "The proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this when I have been able to sign into law the promises of a century." And there was some discussion on the staff about whether that was too strong, because up to this point he had never said what his favorites were, what his the strongest emotions that he had, and shouldn't this be tempered a little bit to say among the strongest? And I said, well, why not ask him to decide? And he said, that's what I want to say. So I remember that quite well. But that had to do with the time around the assassination of Martin Luther King, but not Bobby Kennedy.
During the campaign, the '68 campaign, do you recall any tension in the White House over the comments that Hubert Humphrey was making about Vietnam?
I was aware that that there was some separation between, or there was perceived to be some separation between what Humphrey was saying and what the administration's point was. It always seemed to be kind of minimal. It didn't. And later I was with the president when he made appearances for Humphrey, and so I never really believed at the time. Since then I have been told and have read that it made a great deal of difference to President Johnson, but I didn't think of it at the time.
What do you recall of the Nixon campaign during that period?
Tim, I can't say that that I remember at the time it was going on very much of the campaign. My memory of it is of something that happened about it several years later, and that's very fresh in my mind. But at the time, I wasn't very much aware of what President Nixon was doing.
Let's talk about that
Okay.
incident that you recall.
I wish I knew the year, but I don't. If I'd kept a diary, I would be able to identify it. But at any rate, And as I tell this story, let me tell you that I have not, it's not in any way a secret. And I've told it before. I've told it to my students in classes that I teach and others, but I've never recorded it officially. And I do it now with the a rather sensitive feeling that I'm the only one alive who knows it, and that kind of bothers me. But at any rate, I'll go ahead with it. I had a call from Abe Fortas, who told me there was a story in the Washington Post that troubled him and Clark Clifford, and the story had to do with the fact that the Johnson interests had learned during the Nixon campaign that an approach was being made through a woman named Madame Chenault to the South Vietnamese to propose that they would drag their feet getting back to Paris for the peace talks because they would get a better deal out of President Nixon if he won the election, and it looked at that time as if he would. Fortas said that he and Clifford were very concerned that that they let Mrs. Johnson know about that story, and because the implications were clear that if Humphrey had known about the story, he could have used it and could have won the campaign. And the implication was that that story was being kept away from him. They did not ask me to tell Mrs. Johnson what it was all about, as indeed I don't think they told me that I knew on the phone all about as much as I've just told you. But just I told her that there was something that they needed to talk to her about. She asked me, she said if it's that important I should go, and she asked me if I'd go with her, and I did. So we went to Washington, and we went into the home of Abe Fortas and his wife, and Clark Clifford were there. So there were the two Fortases, Clark Clifford, Lady Bird Johnson, and me. They're all gone now. Together, Fortas and Clifford told her and us that during the campaign, it had been learned that the Nixon campaign was using Madame Chenault as an agent on their behalf to make an approach to the South Vietnamese not to return to the peace table talks in Paris, wait until after the election, because they felt that Nixon would win the election and they'd get a better deal out of President Nixon than they would out of President Humphrey. They felt obliged to tell Mrs. Johnson this because the clear implication was that the Johnson interests were holding that story back.
Ready, Harry.
Pick it up with what?
If you could start with the Mrs. Johnson asked you to accompany her.
Okay. Are we on now?
We're on.
I told Mrs. Johnson about Abe Fortas's call, and she said, well, if it's that important, I should go, and I will. She said, will you go with me? So I did go with her, and we went together to the Fortas home. And there were Abe Fortas and his wife and Clark Clifford. And so together, Clark Clifford and Abe Fortas told her, and since I was there, told us what they felt was so urgent. And it was related to the story that had appeared recently in the Washington Post. And the story, as they told it, was this, that they had learned, the forces around the Johnson White House had learned, and I don't know who it included besides Fortas and Clifford, but at any rate, had learned that the Nixon campaign, and they felt that it involved President Nixon directly, were using a woman named Madame Chenault as an agent on their behalf to make representation to the South Vietnamese that the South Vietnamese should not return to the peace talks in Paris until after the election, because they felt that the South Vietnamese would get a better deal out of President Nixon, who they felt was going to win the election, than they would out of President Humphrey. The reason they felt that Mrs. Johnson should know this, they said, was that there had been some implication in that story that this information had been withheld from Humphrey, and very possibly had cost Humphrey the election, because if Humphrey had had it and had used it, it would have turned the tide and he would have won the election. And they felt that she should know that this was not the case. The reason that it had been, according to them, that it had not been widely known was that they felt, and the others around President Johnson felt, as they put it, that this information was tantamount to treason and implicated President Nixon in this treasonable charge. And that the country had been through so much trauma that year, 1968, that it was, they just did not feel that, that the country should be subjected to this kind of information again, at that stage, that one of the candidates for president who might indeed become president was either guilty of or very close to being guilty of treason. They took that information, according to them, to President Johnson, who said, it's not for us to decide. Let's let Hubert have it and let him decide what to do with it. So the information was conveyed to Humphrey, who agreed with their position that it really was too explosive to be given to the American people and ask them to absorb that as much, along with everything else that they'd had to absorb that explosive year, and he elected not to use it. Well, that was the story. As I said, they're all dead now, but that is the way I heard it. That's the way I heard it at that time. It was terribly well, I don't know, a very difficult story to hear, but that's what I remember, and really the most important thing that I remember out of that whole campaign.
Do you remember Mrs. Johnson's reaction or anyone's reaction?
She was stunned, absolutely stunned. And we talked about it coming back, and she said, she didn't make any she had no reaction, or at least she didn't express any, on to whether she thought that people had acted wisely. She just felt that this was a stunning piece of news.
Was Richard Nixon still president when this visit
Yes.
to Washington? So he was president. So this was during the Watergate period that you heard. It must have been.
I think it was before Watergate.
Well, but President Johnson was dead by this point.
President Johnson was dead, because as I said, I don't, you know, the interesting thing to do it would be to find out when that story appeared in the Washington Post, but I think, I understand there is material here in the library that more or less documents the charge, but I don't relate this to Watergate in any way. I have the feeling that Watergate came later. I don't know when that all began, but I don't think, because it's just not, the two are not related, not tied up in my mind at all.
Do you recall the effect of the revelation of the Pentagon Papers on your work here at the library and on President Johnson?
Well, I do. President Johnson's reaction to the release of the Pentagon Papers was that if the story that the Pentagon Papers told only the story as it came out of the Pentagon files in the Pentagon, that to have the story complete, they'd have to have access to the papers in the White House that came out of the White House. And he was all for their release, and he felt that that they should be made available. So he asked Walt Rostow and me to prepare a rationale that he could take to President Nixon, and that would persuade President Nixon to send a team of experts here to look over the papers on Vietnam and declassify them and make them so they could be made available. Rostow and I tortured this and we didn't come up with anything other than the president's own passionate feeling about it. So our paper to him related that. We felt that the only person that could make that case would be the President Johnson himself, and that he should make the case just as he had put it to us, that it was how important it was, he felt, to the whole story of Vietnam. The last time I saw President Johnson was a week before his death, and that was consequently just a week and a few days before President Nixon's second inaugural. It was at a party, a dinner at the LBJ Ranch on a Saturday night, and my wife and I went, and he took me aside and said he had read the paper that Rostow and I had given him, and he said, okay, if that's the best that can be done, I'll take it that way, and after the president is inaugurated, I'll go to Washington and talk to him about it. That was the last time I saw President Johnson. A week later, he died. After he died, I'm not sure just when the inauguration took place, before or after his death. At any rate, Mrs. Johnson and her daughters took President Johnson's body to Washington, where it lay in state at the Capitol. Tom Johnson, who had been on President Johnson's staff and was still more or less officially on his staff, went with them. He was not a relation to President Johnson, but he went with them. He had occasion, as he later told me, to tell President Nixon about what President Johnson wanted and what he had intended to ask President Nixon to do. A couple of days later, I had a call from Bob Haldeman, who told me that this had come to his attention now, and he'd like to talk to me about it whenever I could get to Washington. So I made a special trip to Washington within that week to talk to Haldeman, and I did. And he said that we went through the whole thing. He said President Nixon was very intrigued by the idea and thought if it could be done, it should be done, but not just with one library, it ought to be done with all the libraries. Did I have any feeling about that? And I said I was sure President Johnson would approve of that. So he called in an assistant whose name was David Young, and told him about it, and gave him the action, and said for him to follow through with all the other presidential libraries to see how they felt about it, and to see how this could be done. I then came back to Austin, very pleased that it was working. I had heard nothing more about it at all for maybe, I'm not sure, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that. When, at that time, I was reading the Washington Post, I saw a story in the Post that the Watergate burglars I'm not quite sure what action had been taken, but they had met in David Young's office, and all of those there was some. They were all under some kind of question at that time. I remembered the story quite well because David Young's office was one that I had first used when I was when in the White House. That was the end of it, so far as I was concerned, until much later at Hofstra University in Long Island. There was a symposium reviewing the Nixon presidency, and for some reason I was invited to be there. I had very little to participate in. But in the company of Bob Haldeman, I told that story, and it was the first time he had heard it related that way, but he didn't disagree with it.
Not too long afterwards, you also heard about Alexander Butterfield's testimony. What was your reaction when you heard that there were tapes in the Nixon White House?
Well, I have to go back. After President Johnson died, a woman that had been in his employ for a long time, named Mildred Stiegel, came to me and said that she had in her possession, because President Johnson had left them with her for safekeeping, recordings of conversations, telephone conversations President Johnson had recorded in the White House. They had never been released, and he had left them with her with instructions that if they were still in her care at the time he died, she should turn them over to me with instructions that they be kept closed for a period of 50 years. So I accepted them on that basis. Later I began to, well, anyway, at that time I accepted that basis and signed whatever it was that I signed. And we did nothing, well, yes, we did do something about it. They were in, as I recall, 7 or 8 record center cartons. The archive staff, Charles Corcoran and Tina Houston, at least looked at them, and they were dictabelts or something, outmoded media types. And so their feeling, which they conveyed to me, which I certainly accepted, was that the first thing to do was to preserve them, because if they just were kept in that state 50 years from now, if we honored that 50-year rule, they'd all be dust. And so there ought to be some way to separate them. And so that it became, excuse me, it became an archives matter from my point of view. They took it over and did what they had to do to preserve the tapes themselves. And it was not really a matter of great concern to me until I read about read about whatever it was, the tapes in the Nixon White House. And I was having lunch in Washington with a columnist named Marianne Means. And I decided to tell her about it. I said, we had these tapes too, but they've been I don't know what's in them. They're closed for 50 years. I think that was probably the first time that there had been any kind of public acknowledgement of them. Nothing really happened much. There wasn't any enormous interest in them, so far as I can remember. Some, but I think, but nonetheless, no movement on my part or on anybody else's part until several things happened. One was there was a lawsuit between General Westmoreland and CBS, and I was subpoenaed to produce anything that I had that would relate to that period of time. It turned out, and I think this is the first time that I had realized, made me aware of it, that a few of the tapes had been transcribed in the White House, not many, but a few, and a couple of them related to this particular period. So we turned those over and maybe turn the tapes themselves over. So that was the first intrusion into those tapes. The second one came when the Congress mandated a certain release of all materials that related to something else, and we had to turn that over. But in
Was
the
it
meantime,
the assassination? Was it when they were doing the Assassination Review Board?
of course it was. Yes, of course it was. But in the meantime, in between those two incidents, my own sense of began to really nag at me that we ought to break that ban and open them. I was moved by the fact that since the subpoenas were in the works somewhere, one of these days we were going to be subpoenaed, and we'd have to do it without any preparation. That was one of the things that was in my mind. But the other was that Johnson had, when I became director of the library, wanted everything opened as quickly as possible here, and this flew into the face of those instructions. So I was on a vacation down in Acapulco, excuse me, with Mrs. Johnson, and I told her about the tapes for the first time. She knew nothing about them, and I told her that I really felt that they were bound to be of historical interest, and that I really felt that we should release them. And she said she'd support whatever I decided to do, and that was, to my mind, that was the key element in our finally releasing them. So we began opening them and releasing them in 1992, I think, and now they're all released.
Harry, I've just got to ask you.
You what?
See, I have to ask you if you can remember Mrs. Johnson's reaction. You just told her that her husband had, well, roughly 800 hours of recordings. I mean, what?
She asked me when she said she'd support anything I wanted. She asked me if I would myself listen to anything that I felt was really questionable and think strongly about whether it should be released. I said I would. I made that arrangement with the archivists. So I didn't listen to all of the tapes, but anything that they felt there was some question about, they brought to me. There was, so far as I can remember, and they would know, there was very, very little that I felt should be closed, and I can't even, and nothing that reflected in any way on President Johnson. I think occasionally something would come up, perhaps that suggested some kind of law violation on somebody else's part, and we would release that. But I doubt that any of those things are closed now. But I'll tell you, Tim, there were some things that were certainly questionable, and because and I couldn't imagine why these were made. And then I finally realized that they were accidental. President Johnson, to my mind, he did not flick the button himself. It was done outside his office by a secretary, and maybe two secretaries. And I think sometimes after a conversation that he had felt should be recorded and had so indicated, the machine was inadvertently left on. So that it's the only explanation I can think of for the conversation he had with the president of Hagar Slacks when he was ordering some slacks for himself and and he was talking to the president of the company and gave him far more anatomical information than probably was necessary. I heard that, I must have heard it earlier, but I don't remember it. But we were having a symposium here at the library, and we were out at the LBJ Ranch when there was a great reunion of Johnson people. We're having at lunch in a tent at the ranch, and the occasion was to play some of those tapes, and I heard that a conversation about the Slacks for what I thought was the first time, and realized that Mrs. Johnson was listening to it too for the first time. And I thought, but she didn't talk to me about it, so I don't know. But it was embarrassing. But you know, that's the worst we ever got out of it, was an embarrassment. There was nothing at all that has ever come out in those tapes have I had occasion to regret releasing.
Did you find out who knew? Did you ever take the time to ask among President Johnson's inner circle about who knew about the taping system?
I certainly asked around, and I couldn't find anyone who did know, although it did turn out later that that Jack Valenti probably knew what was going on, but I don't think anybody else did. I don't know. I think you might ask Larry Temple if he knew about it, but I don't think anybody really knew about it at the time. If they did, they didn't relate it to the larger business of this massive telephone of 845 telephone conversations that were related. I don't think anybody really did know about it.
Well, and what's also, of course, is interesting about this collection is it includes cabinet room tapes. President Johnson also, for some reason, in 1968, began taping in the cabinet room.
I'm not sure that those have been released. Now, maybe they have.
They haven't been. Transcripts have appeared in the Foreign Relations to the U.S. series.
I remember now. There were 7 record center cartons, and 6 of them were telephone tapes. The 7th were tapes of conversations recorded in the cabinet room, and so the idea when we decided to release these was to concentrate on the telephone tapes, and the cabinet tapes would follow suit later. By the time I retired, the cabinet tapes had not been touched yet, so whether they've been released by this time, I don't know. And they were all, as I recall, the way Mildred Stegall told me about it, they were all in 1968, and they all related to Vietnam.
But we didn't. You never were able to find anyone who could tell you why he started.
Never. I have my own. I came to grips with the idea eventually, and my own idea, which I finally developed, was that he was aware of the fact that the people that he was talking to did not know that he was doing this, and it was really to protect them. That he was not concerned, I think, about himself, but he was concerned about Senator Smathers and the other members, particularly the members of Congress, that he was talking to, who did not have any idea that he was taping the conversation. So I think that was probably why he chose not to release them.
Did you ever come to a theory of why he taped in the first place?
Well, this is sort of a matter of interest right now. My first feeling was that he was doing it for history. But Bob Hardesty and I came down with him after his administration ended to work with him on his book, his memoirs. And Hardesty has remarked on several occasions, and I agree with him, we could have made that book so much more interesting if we knew about those telephone tapes, but he didn't tell us about it. So if he was interested in this for history, it was not the history he was going to write. It was history down the line, and I don't know, but that's what I thought at the time. It must have been for the historical record, but I can't go any further than that with it because I don't know.
Well, because he did, at least in the first couple of years, he did have the secretarial pool produce transcripts, but then there are fewer and fewer. And I was wondering if you came to the conclusion that he might have had these transcripts to use them.
He did not. We didn't see them. Now, I think Doris Kearns indicated that she saw a transcript or two because she worked with us a little bit on the book. I never saw them. Hardesty never saw them. So, and I don't think there were many of the transcripts. Whatever there are now part of the record. But they did not seem to me to be significant at the time.
To go back to the story of the Chenault affair and your trip to Washington, do you believe that Abe Fortas and Clark Clifford wanted to convey this information to Mrs. Johnson to ease her mind about how Hubert Humphrey was treated? Was that the reason?
Yes,
so
that's
that she wouldn't think that something vital to his campaign had been withheld from her?
Precisely, yes.
Okay. So there was no follow-on action after that?
No.
It was just to tell Mrs. Johnson?
No, as long as, no, I think you asked me about her reaction and how she was stunned, but I do remember her saying how courageous of Hubert was.
And you never had a chance to speak to Hubert Humphrey about this, did you?
No, I wish I had. And he doesn't ever refer to it at all in anything he wrote after that either.
Now, there's a little reference to this in the memoirs, in Vantage Point. Just a little, not to this meeting, obviously, but to the Chenault matter.
Really?
Yes.
I don't remember this. That? Well, I mean, there might have been. I mean, there's a. I think the Chenault thing broadly was one thing, but I think the difference in what the Clifford and Fortas were conveying to Mrs. Johnson was the Nixon participation in it. I think that was it. I think the fact that Chenault was involved in something with the South Vietnamese was not all that considered all that important.
In Vantage Point, President Johnson says that he's sure that Nixon wasn't involved.
Well.
Who actually, do you remember who worked on that portion? How did you divide up responsibility for the memoir?
Well, I think probably, when we came down here, Bob Hardesty and I were the ones that came down with President Johnson to work on it. He later asked Doris Kearns to come down, and she worked on a little bit of it. Walt Rostow did not come down for that purpose, but he came down to take a job at the University of Texas, and he was going to be an advisor to President Johnson, and so he had an office here in the library, and through an arrangement that they made together, Walt took on the responsibility for all of the foreign affairs stuff, with the help of Bill Jordan from the State Department, who came down on leave from the State Department to help Walt on that. So this story that I have related, I would have been much more comfortable about had I made it public, my part of it, the part that I knew public, when everybody else, or some of them at least, were alive. I think I'm sorry I'm the only one left who was there in that building at the time to hear Clifford and Fortas related, but that's the way it works.
And they both related. They both were telling
Yes, they
the story.
both did. They were both involved at the time. To whatever extent, I don't know, but they were both aware of the information.
Harry, thank you for your time.
Sure.
Gentlemen, thank you.